And so I'm really delighted to introduce Don Gayton. So he's our keynote speaker, and he's a consulting ecologist and writer. He's going to be talking about Fire in the Dry Forest, A Pilgrim's Progress. Don.
Thank you. So this was originally planned as an evening talk. After you've had a nice meal and a glass of wine or two, and so you'll have to bear with me. Am I visible here?
Yep, we see you.
Okay.
You are.
So my first exposure to fire came in the 1950s when I was a kid in Southern California. We lived in a working class neighborhood in the town of Pasadena. To the north of town was a range of low hills covered with those tough and incredibly volatile shrubs we called chaparral. Wealthy Pasadena folks thought it was a good idea to build expensive designer homes on these chaparral hillsides. And of course, to everyone's complete surprise, the chaparral would catch fire every so often, and men like my father would go and volunteer to help fight those fires. Now, even as a dumb young kid, I remember sensing that there were two things wrong with this scenario. First, why would you build a house on a hillside that catches fire? And second, if a fire had started in our neighborhood, I was pretty sure none of those wealthy folks would come down from the hills to help us put our fire out. My next encounter with fire came when I was a junior high school kid living in the rural community of Dungeness on Washington State's Olympic Peninsula. I used to hang out with my classmate Tommy, whose family owned a dairy farm along the Dungeness River. On Sunday afternoon, we walked out into the pasture to a single massive old veteran cedar tree. Now, the base of that tree was hollow, and there was an opening just right at ground level that was just big enough for us to crawl into. But it turns out there's nothing quite as dark as the inside of a hollow cedar tree. But of course, I had a pack of matches with me, and so I lit a few up just to look around. The inner walls of the tree were covered with a very dry and very thin strips of wood, the kind that you would use for tinder. After a few minutes of lighting matches and exploring and not finding any hidden treasures, we crawled back out of the tree and went on to other adventures. The next morning, I was on the school bus, which passed right by Tommy's farm, when the bus came to a sudden and very unexpected stop. Intrigued, I went to the front of the bus to see what was going on. Several utility trucks were parked on the road and men with chainsaws moved about. The power line was down, as well as the pasture fences on either side of the county road, and the road itself was covered with sawdust. Then I noticed these huge round sections of freshly cut wood lying everywhere. Slowly, ever so slowly, the realization dawned. That massive old cedar tree in the adjacent pasture was no longer in its usual place, and my future on the planet was in serious doubt. So now fast forward a bunch of years, more than I'd care to admit, to 1990. I was a new Forest Service range management officer working out of Nelson, British Columbia. And the district manager said to me, "Gayton, there's this little problem that's cropped up between the ranchers and the elk hunters in the Rocky Mountain Trench over in the East Kootenays. So I want you to just pop over there and sort things out." Boy, talk about getting thrown into a snake pit. The ranchers hated the hunters and the hunters detested the ranchers. Depending on who you talked to, the cows were gobbling up every last blade of grass and leaving none for the elk. Or else there were hordes of elk coming onto the grasslands in the middle of the night and vacuuming up all of the forage for the cattle. And to top it off, I discovered that this fight was not new at all. In fact, it had gone on for 2 generations. Now, whenever I'm faced with a crisis, my automatic response is to begin doing archival research. So I dug into the history of this East Kootenay dogfight. And here's a bit of what I discovered. One of the earliest studies of East Kootenai elk cattle conflict was done by a guy named Howard Peisch in 1970. And here's a couple of quotes from his study. It has become apparent during the course of this study that the rangelands are really a product of human activity, and that human activity will be needed to maintain them. And another quote. The problem of competition between range users has been overstated, and the more urgent problem of range losses through forest regeneration needs urgent attention. Then in 1974, the coordinated resource management planning era began, kickstarted by E. William Anderson, a range consultant from Oregon. Bill Anderson's genius was his ability to get all the players not only to sit at the same poker table, but to show their cards as well. Then in 1979, the British Columbia Ombudsman weighed in on the East Kootenai elk cattle conflict and said, and I quote, "I had not expected to find so many problems so strongly expressed from such a small area of the province." Obviously, this ombudsman had not been forewarned about the East Kootenays. Now, the same ombudsman also hired a wildlife biologist by the name of Valerius Geist to analyze the situation. And Geist said, "The central problem of the East Kootenai agriculture-wildlife conflict is a shrinking forage resource due to forest encroachment." Next, there was the Klosky report in 1989, and then in 1990, the East Kootenai Trench Agriculture Wildlife Committee was created. And that was precisely the time I came on the scene as a newly minted range officer fresh off the boat from Saskatchewan. The Trench Committee, as it came to be called, started organizing a series of hunter-rancher meetings, which I attended. It was at one of those contentious rancher-hunter meetings in Cranbrook that I had an epiphany, a life-changing moment. In the middle of heated debate, a young man entered the meeting room pushing a handcart with an enormous tree slab on it. The debaters were stunned speechless by this unexpected event. Seizing the moment, the young man, Mark Hall, pointed to one side of the tree cross-section which had a large open cat face, and he explained that this tough old ponderosa pine had survived many fires, each one leaving a scar. And he went on to say, historically, the Rocky Mountain Trench experienced frequent fire, which meant there was lots of open grasslands and forage enough for both cows and elk. And then another guy in the audience, I think it was either Morris Hanson or Ray Wilson, spoke up saying, "You know, we can either fight each other for nothing or work together and get paid for it." The meeting went quiet for a minute while that piece of cowboy wisdom was digested. Some actual productive discussion ensued, but by then I was not paying any attention. I was examining the tiny fire scars on the tree cookie, fascinated. I am prone to obsessions, and suddenly here was a new one for me, dendropyrochronology. A few months after my Cranbrook awakening, I booked off to attend a week-long workshop in Montana. The North American Dendroecology Field Week was a delightfully intensive mix of field work and microscope work, and I learned about the intricacies of tree rings and fire scar dating. One of the instructors was Emily Heyerdahl, a real force of nature. During that time, I also connected with other luminaries in fire ecology like Dr. Delory Daniels and Bob Gray. And after that, I went on to read all the published fire histories in the dry interior of BC and the Pacific Northwest, and additionally had the project of doing my own small project, a fire history of the Trout Creek Ecological Reserve in the Canadian Okanagan Valley. The outcomes of all of these research projects are remarkably similar, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this pattern, but it bears repeating. Beginning in the 1700s, there was a period of frequent, small, low-intensity fires, many of which intentionally set by First Nations, together with occasional large drought-induced wildfires. Then, beginning in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, this long-established pattern of small and frequent fires essentially stopped, followed by a period of very infrequent fires. Then by the 1920s and 30s, fire was back again, but this time as very large and even regional conflagrations due to railways, mining, and drought. Morphing yet again in the 1940s, fire frequency dropped dramatically as fire suppression took hold. So it is important to note that the era of First Nations prescribed fire goes back far earlier than the 1700s, but it's just that here in the dry interior, we tend to run out of recorder trees that are more than a couple hundred years old. But I was gratified to hear that Greg Green had found one that goes all the way back to the 1400s. So getting back to the local history in the East Kootenays, the Trench Committee really grabbed hold of the notion of thinning and prescribed burning in the early 1990s. A whole raft of local people got involved: ranchers, hunters, foresters, civil servants, researchers, and environmentalists. A couple of important external collaborators were Cliff White from Alberta and Charles Kay from Utah. I do remember going on a field trip to meet up with George Curtis from the U.S. Forest Service at Pinkham Creek near Eureka in Montana. That trip gave us some real incentive because the Montana folks were far ahead of us in terms of prescribed burning. It has always been gospel in BC that if you do prescribed burns at all, you only do them in early spring, which of course is for us is fiscal year end at the time when no agency has any money. The Americans showed us that fall burns can also be a safe and viable option under the right circumstances. Now, because of the intense interest in the East Kootenays around how much forage was being consumed and by which animals, we built some new grazing exclosures and we revisited some old ones. I was tasked with some of the vegetation monitoring, and that became yet another obsession of mine. And I still love spending hours and hours on hands and knees, staring into a Daubenmire frame, remembering all the plant scientific names and trying to decide if Pseudoregnaria spicata has 22% cover or 26% cover. It is a labor of love. And it is also worth remembering that back in the 1990s, there was intense controversy in BC about the notion of fire-maintained ecosystems and the wisdom of reintroducing fire. The Forest Science research team in Kamloops was dead set against frequent fire theories, and the arguments were fierce. The papers by Shinneman and Baker added fuel to the fire. I do remember attending a meeting in Kamloops where the adversaries squared off in an intense debate. Greg Anderson, a real spark plug who was with the Ministry of Forests in Invermere, was also at the meeting. Right in the middle of the debate, Greg stood up and interrupted, saying, "You know, it's really good that you people are all stalled in this philosophical argument, because over in the East Kootenays, we are moving ahead quickly and we need all the available funding for our prescribed burns." So there you have it, the thumbnail history. Some of you British Columbians will remember the Biodiversity Guidebook from 1995, which explicitly stated that the 3 biogeoclimatic subzones of bunchgrass, ponderosa pine, and the dry phases of the interior Douglas fir are, quote, historically fire-maintained ecosystems, or natural disturbance type 4. It is no surprise that the Forest Service of the day quickly disavowed itself from that guidebook, but we did not. And now we can't forget that vast plethora of acronymic plans and organizations here in BC that each added their own bit of momentum to the prescribed fire movement. My list includes CORE, KBLUP, TRRRMP, EMBER, NDT4, RMT, ERP, et cetera, and I'm sure I've missed a few. Fast forward to today. And the province of BC is inching towards a more proactive program of fuel reduction and prescribed burning in our dry, low elevation urban interface forests, with an emphasis on inching. The scale of our activity is still dwarfed by the magnitude of the problem. You know, I used to think of prescribed burning in dry forests as a win-win, an activity that reduces fuel accumulation as at the same time as it enhances habitat for both wild and domestic ungulates. But then I began to see it as a win-win-win by adding the element of First Nations reconciliation. And what I mean by that is working directly with local First Nations and planning, executing, and monitoring prescribed burning projects, at the same time as we learn from each other's lifeways and knowledge systems. This process is starting to happen in parts of the BC interior. Now, I have been a long-time advocate for a national park, and we're finally going to get one, the South Okanagan-Similkameen National Park Reserve. Much of the terrain included within the park boundary is NDT4, or historically fire maintained. So along with the East Kootenays, the Okanagan-Similkameen will become another experimental laboratory for prescribed fire, managed by Parks Canada, which is no stranger to understanding and using fire. The Lower Similkameen Indian Band is actively engaged in the park negotiations, and we do look forward to a park with significant First Nations management involvement. Now, lately I've been looking into historical salmon runs in the Upper Columbia River. The story of the dams, the displacement of whole communities, both white and Indigenous, and the collapse of the salmon runs is a story that is both fascinating and disturbing at the same time. In my salmon reading, I discovered a link between two of my favorite obsessions, dendrochronology and marine-derived nutrients. Scientists can actually detect wider growth rings in trees along rivers that host spawning salmon. And this is confirmed via the magic of nitrogen isotope discrimination. It turns out that there has been a millennial transfer of nutrients harvested by Chinook and sockeye far out in the North Pacific Ocean, and then brought to animals and plants along salmon rivers in the BC interior. We're just now beginning to understand the impacts of dams, not only on salmon runs, but on this continental scale transfer of marine-derived nutrients. Now, I bear some intergenerational responsibility for this, since my father worked as a laborer on Grand Coulee Dam in the summer of 1935. Grand Coulee gave jobs to thousands of people like my father in the worst of the Great Depression, but Grand Coulee was also the first massive stake driven right into the heart of the Columbia River. So if we add the ecological impact of hydroelectric dams onto fire suppression in our dry interior valleys, and then factor in climate change on top of those two, there should be lots of work for us ecologists. It is a growth industry. And now to close, I need to acknowledge that climate elephant in the room. There is a great and creative irony about living in the southern interior during this time of global climate crisis. Scientists and politicians and activists and the media and even Greta Thunberg are all admonishing us to say, by saying, plant trees and stop forest fires. And here we're politely raising our hands and saying, well, yes, that's absolutely true in the big picture, but here in this little corner of the dry interior, things are slightly different. And we have too many trees and too much fuel, and we have unique, special biogeoclimatic circumstances and fire-maintained ecosystems and yada, yada, yada. How surprising that the world is going in one direction and we are going in another. But I do celebrate our grand tradition of dissent and of doing things in our own way, which in this case is absolutely the right way. Thinning, prescribed burning, and fuel reduction in dry, low elevation forests is very much in line with reducing our carbon footprint. It also reminds us of the potential for long-term carbon sequestration in our native grasslands. So by adding carbon storage to the First Nations / urban interface / ungulate forage equation, now we are looking at a win-win-win-win scenario, and we don't even have to go to Las Vegas to get it. Thank you. So I do have some random slides here, if I can figure out how to pull them up. I think this is it.
Right.
Does that work?
I think it's, yes, it has.
Amazing. Talk about technophobes. I was going to bring and show my my clamshell flip phone, which is probably the last functional one on the planet. Okay, here's just a few images to reinforce what I've talked about. Lees and Clutterbuck, some wealthy English aristocrats that came visiting north of Cranbrook in 1887. Here's how they described the landscape. And there's a relic landscape near Kimberley, near the rodeo grounds, one of very few remaining that reflects that that historical ecosystem state. And this was the tree cookie that I think started it off. It was from Canal Flats, and it was cut down, I think, back in the early 90s. And it was the first concrete evidence that we had about frequent fire in the Rocky Mountain Trench. And there's Emily Hairdall from that native workshop. She was the chainsaw queen. She certainly knew her way around a chainsaw. And here's the lab work. If you haven't done native, they hold it in various parts of North America, and it's well worth it. And this becomes, you know, for people like myself, this is like porn. So looking at those tree rings and fire scars. And this is again referring back to the early days of the Trench Committee in the early 90s. And it was kind of a remarkable organization that really broke some barriers. Some of the individuals involved in those early meetings. And there's Randy Harris, who became a chair later on, and it was a management challenge sometimes with the committee, which he acknowledges. Prescribed burn in the trench. This is again from the early 90s. And there are, you know, in those days anyway, you could be a tourist in the burn. Don't get to do that as much anymore. Gee, my beard was quite a bit darker then than now. And I love this picture, just pretty casual, you know, work a day job, doing prescribed burning at the appropriate time, the appropriate place, under the appropriate conditions. And the BC Welfare Service is very, very good at that. They're like surgeons. They really know what they're doing. This is sort of ironic. Our former prime minister, our premier, was celebrating the 6 billionth tree planted in a dry, bony hillside just north of Kelowna. And I monitored that poor bloody tree, and about 3 years later it died. So nice thought, but inappropriate location. Some more of the personalities from the Trench Committee days. And there's Bruno de la Salle on the right, and he's doing part of the work on establishing the South Okanagan-Similkameen National Park Reserve. Bob Gray and Dale Swedberg, I learned a lot from both of these two characters, and they were doing a fire history in the Senalahican, which is just south of the border in Okanagan County. And Annie Kruger, you've already seen a picture of her. She was a great lady who's passed on, but she really, and the notion of the firekeeper, I think, was an important one in First Nations culture, in that it was a lifetime designation. And I think that makes a lot of sense for us honkies, because fire is such a complex force that it takes a lifetime to understand it. And this is something that has bothered me as a person who likes to do extension and public presentations about fire ecology and Indigenous cultural burning and so on. We have very few images of actually doing that, and the very few images we do have are mostly about burning grasslands. And so if anybody has an example that they are willing to share of cultural burning in dry forest types, I would certainly love to get my hands on it. So I think this is all old hat to most of you. I also am cognizant of the fact that our grasslands have the highest biodiversity of any ecosystem type in BC. And as the encroachment and ingrowth occurs, that biodiversity decreases. Here's a couple of shots. I mentioned the grazing exposure. This is at Skookumchuck in the Rocky Mountain Trench. 1950, I think the tallest thing out there at this time was the cow shit. And here is the same exposure in 1995. So in this instance, the cows were suppressing the forest ingrowth. But it does show that in the absence of grazing and the absence of fire, this is the natural process. A very depressing shot of the grasslands of the Central Caribou, where in the absence of fire, Douglas fir and mostly Douglas fir and some ponderosa pine are just in the process of taking over. And Randy dug this one up for me on Windermere, north of Cranbrook, looking east into the Rocky Mountains across Columbia Lake, 1906. Nice open forest, parkland landscape on the west side, lots of openings on the east side, and fast forward to 2015. and you have essentially closed forests and all the ecological consequences and fuel consequences related to that. So, you know, this is one of my favorite shots of, you know, are we going to let things get this far when you have extreme fire risk and essentially a biological desert, a biodiversity desert within it? Fortunately, there aren't too many landscapes that look like that. And is this our, you know, our traditional approach to fire management? Hopefully not. So this is the paradox that that we as agencies and ecologists and institutions need to embrace, but also the general public. And I think it's been mentioned several times that is a real barrier. And here in the Okanagan, where we have lots of new immigrants from the lower mainland who have no concept of fire, want to live in the, you know, in the suburbs, up in the hillsides, and it is a huge challenge for not only institutions and scientists, but society as a whole. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Don. And it's so helpful always to see photographs, and especially I'm really glad that you showed that one of the tree cookie that you were referencing earlier on, because yeah, I agree, it's fascinating. Immediately I started looking at how you would count all those rings, but I'd love to open it up for questions, and so folks can either ask to be unmuted or send pop a question into the chat, or well, we can just go ahead and proceed that way. So not sure if anyone wants to start off. So Kelsey Copes-Gerbitz says, how do you think the archival or historical perspective has helped you think about the ways in which we need to address fire risk in the future? That's a great question.
You know, it's a bit of a rabbit hole, the archival research and even the tree ring research, but you know, how ecosystems function historically is one of the only roadmaps we have about how they're going to function in the future. Mind you, we have this incredibly complex new factor of climate change that we have to build in. But Dr. Richard Hebda, who's a paleoecologist, and has weighed in on this issue, and he says the best way to prepare for climate change is to create resilient ecosystems. And I think to understand what resilience is, we really have to go back into archival research, the photographs, the archival photographs, the early history accounts, the First Nations stories and histories. You know, there's actually quite a wonderful set of aerial photographs of the Okanagan from 1938, which I have used heavily in my work. So there are bits and pieces like that, and the fellow that did the old fire tower rephotography in the Canadian Rockies, that was incredibly useful. So archival research is important, but it also provides a rabbit hole for people like myself. So
yeah, thank you. So we have a couple more questions. Let's see. So Eleanor Bassett is wondering, is there work done connecting these historical changes of fire and vegetation to changes in the soils? Oh, that's a great question.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Sorry, my screen went blank.
Oh,
you know,
did you need me to repeat it, or okay?
Yeah, I think I'm back. I certainly see this in the encroachment of ponderosa pine into the grasslands as it moves down slope. that the soils begin to acidify through the needle cast. I mean, it's an incremental process that takes some time, but the soils acidify. There's a duff accumulation, the soils cool down, and that encourages even more ingrowth. So that's certainly one soils factor that I've been able to identify in my work.
That's great. And then Lori Daniels has just shared in the chat, but phytoliths in the soils are one way to examine fire history via soils. Although I'm going to be perfectly honest and say I'm a wildlife biologist. I don't know what phytoliths are. Do you know what they are, Don?
Lori, you're much better prepared to answer that than I.
Certainly. I'm glad to pipe up a little bit here. So phytoliths are the silica particles that are within the vegetation, and so they're resistant to decay. In grasses, the phytoliths tend to be long and linear, as are the leaves of the grasses, whereas in conifers, the phytoliths tend to be, in the case of Douglas fir, they look like little Sputniks. They're round with spiky parts to them. So as the plant parts decompose into the soil, they leave behind these silica particles in the soil profile that gradually decompose. So you can take samples through the soil and extract the phytoliths and look at the proportion of long linear grass types versus conifer types. In the case of Douglas fir, these round Sputniky types. And if you take different soil layers or different soil horizons near the surface versus deep in the soil and look at the change in proportions, it gives some interpretation about what vegetation is present today versus in the past as you go deeper in the soil profile. There's lots of caveats to that particular approach, but it's a very interesting way, and one in which people have been able to demonstrate historical vegetation composition versus composition today, and in particular to be able to reinforce or to test hypotheses about how long has forest encroachment into grasslands been taking place. You know, was this a give and take, a fluid ecotone, or is this new encroachment of forests into what used to be permanent grasslands, and vice versa? So it's a really fascinating approach, and one that has been used in a few places in BC, but we could certainly be using it more.
Fascinating.
Lori, I have a question for you. That research you presented about the Creston area, you know, the elevational gradient,
yeah,
and that those mid-elevation montanes or ICH and MS, has that registered at all with the authorities that we're really looking at a very similar fire return interval as the low elevation ponderosa pine?
I would say yes and no. I think there's some acknowledgement now that some of what we call it the NDT3, which is that band that sits directly above the NDT4, so the natural disturbance types, you know, we still accept the valley bottoms had surface fire, but this mid-elevation idea that it was all high severity fire, people now talk about an NDT 3.4, where they're saying, well, we call it a 3, but it has these characteristics of the 4. I think we're still really underestimating how much surface fire there was across elevation zones in many places in BC. And I think that's to our detriment, because we're making a lot of management choices on outdated information. So we're working hard to get that information to the powers that be and to see if we can't help facilitate some shifts in thinking, those transformative changes to how we're thinking about forest management across the landscape. In BC, we're really focused, as you know, we've been very focused on timber production, and that's not serving us well. We saw it in 2017 and 2018, and the companies and the forest managers in those landscapes, I think have kind of had this wake-up call. I think other places in BC that have not yet seen such large, widespread, intense fires are still a little slow to the game to talk about landscape level management and planning. So, yeah, we're trying to get the word out, Dawn.
Good.
And then we have a question from Mike Black. He says, thanks for a great presentation, Don. Given climate change and invasive species, what do you think vegetation is going to look like in our open forest sites in 2100? Oof,
Yeah.
that's a big one.
Yeah. Well, as a guy who's just turning 75, that's not going to be my problem. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the invasive issue is a big one. I'm seeing weeds like sulfur cinquefoil that, we have no chance of biological control for it, and it's encroaching. I just finished some contract work on several weeds that are not found in BC, but are just found south of the border, and that are just waiting for the opportunity to move north into BC. I don't know. I mean, I'm a real grassland advocate, but I think there are good grounds for that in terms of biodiversity and species at risk, that if you want to do something for biodiversity in these dry interior valleys, you protect the grasslands and you protect the wetlands, and you restore them where you can.
Thank you, Don. And I think that just to be respectful of everyone's times, that this is going to be maybe where we'll transition off, but I would absolutely encourage anyone who has follow-up questions to reach out to the speakers.